It was the kind of morning that seemed too pretty for tragedy. The sun broke softly through a pale Cincinnati sky, brushing light across the rows of porch-lined streets in Walnut Hills. The neighborhood was stirring awake, mailboxes clanging shut, the clatter of bicycles rolling down curbs, the faint whistle of a factory horn calling workers to their shifts. It was April 4th, 1967, another spring day, ordinary in every way, except for what was about to unfold. 12-year-old Mary Ellen Parker left her small cream-colored house on Peebles Avenue at precisely 7:45 a.m. The air was crisp. Her breath came out in little puffs as she clutched her school books to her chest. She waved goodbye to her mother, who stood barefoot on the porch steps, her robe fluttering slightly in the breeze. They had argued softly that morning about a misplaced lunchbox, something so trivial that Clara Parker would later replay it endlessly, hearing her own voice echo like a warning she could never take back. Mary Ellen was quiet, known for her neat handwriting and her habit of biting her nails. She was the kind of child teachers called responsible, though shy. Her routine was predictable. The same short walk to Roosevelt Elementary every day, same spot in the front row, same seat on the bus when it rained. Neighbors along the route even waved to her by habit. But on that particular morning, only one would ever remember seeing her. Lucy Sanders, her best friend, told police later that they started the walk together. They talked about a class spelling bee coming up that Friday. When they reached the alley near the side entrance of the schoolyard, Mary Ellen stopped. Lucy said she'd dropped a pencil and bent to pick it up. When she looked up, Mary Ellen was gone. No scream, no running footsteps. Nothing but the wind through the branches overhead. By the time the first bell rang at 8 a.m., Mary Ellen's absence passed without much notice. A handful of students were late that morning. Attendance wasn't finalized until after lunch. Her teacher assumed she was homesick. No one called her house. No one checked the alley. At 3:20 p.m., Clara Parker stood outside the school gates waiting among the crowd of parents. One by one, children spilled out, laughing and shouting, their sneakers slapping against the pavement. When the flow slowed to a trickle and the teachers began locking doors, Clara felt the first grip of panic. She searched every face, scanning the windows above, her heart racing faster with each passing minute. When the janitor told her maybe she went home already, she ran. Her kitchen was empty. The lunchbox still sat on the counter. By nightfall, the neighborhood had mobilized. Men grabbed flashlights, women formed phone chains, and groups searched block after block under the glow of street lamps. Police officers scoured nearby lots and construction sites. Even the Ohio riverbanks were checked by morning. There was no sign of her. Not a shoe, not a ribbon, not a trace. By the third day, the story made the back page of the Cincinnati Enquirer, overshadowed by protests on college campuses and a headline about rising tension in Vietnam. Still, for Walnut Hills, it was the only story that mattered. Children were suddenly driven to school instead of walking. Store owners began locking doors earlier. Rumors spread. A stranger in a black sedan, a man seen smoking near the playground fence, a maintenance worker who left town abruptly. None of it led anywhere. Detective Samuel Rooker led the initial investigation, a heavy-set man known for his bluntness and long hours. He interviewed teachers, janitors, neighbors, even the mailman. Every alibi checked out. Every trail went cold. There were no fingerprints, no ransom notes, no phone calls. Within 2 months, the case file thinned into silence. But some details refused to sit still. Neighbors remembered hearing an odd clanging that morning, like metal scraping against the school's basement vents. The janitor dismissed it as routine maintenance. Their cafeteria worker told detectives she noticed Principal Harold Benton leaving the building unusually early that day, around 7:30 a.m. before most staff arrived. He said he had a dentist appointment. It was never confirmed. The case faded into legend, whispered among new teachers and students for decades after. The school grounds were renovated in 1985, and the old basement sealed off during construction. A few locals claimed Mary Ellen's ghost lingered in those halls, but most simply stopped talking about her altogether. Cincinnati moved on, or pretended to, until the fall of 2025. It began with a documentary series being filmed about unsolved Midwest mysteries. The crew contacted Roosevelt Elementary, hoping to include the Mary Ellen case as a short segment. The current principal agreed, but insisted they speak with the retired one, Harold Benton, now 83, living quietly in a care home just outside the city. Benton hadn't spoken publicly in years. When the young producer sat across from him, recorder blinking red, she expected a few nostalgic recollections, maybe old photos, a quote about how tragedy leaves scars. What she didn't expect was Benton's confession. Halfway through the interview, his voice trembled. He shut his eyes, whispering, "I should have told someone. I should have said something back then." The room went still. The producer leaned forward. "Said something about what?" she asked. He hesitated, hands trembling. "About the girl," he said. "About Mary Ellen. What happened to her?" In the days that followed, his recorded words would spread through the city like wildfire. Former students, now parents themselves, watched in disbelief as the local news replayed his voice, cracking under guilt and time. Roosevelt Elementary, the quiet school buried in history, would once again become the center of every conversation, every whisper, every long-forgotten fear. And with that one confession, Cincinnati's oldest mystery began to unravel, not with a new piece of evidence, but with the conscience of an aging man finally breaking under the weight of silence. The question was no longer what happened to Mary Ellen Parker. It was, why had the truth been buried for nearly 60 years? And who had helped keep it that way? The news broke on a Wednesday evening. Local channels cut their regular programming to air an emergency segment titled Cincinnati, Principal's Cold Case Confession. What aired next would silence living rooms all across Ohio. Viewers saw a frail man, his hands folded over a blanket, voice quivering as if weighted by 50 years of guilt. His nameplate read, "Harold J. Benton, former principal, Roosevelt Elementary." In a voice that teetered between exhaustion and regret, Benton began recounting details that no one outside the original police team could have known. He spoke of a disagreement, a cover-up, and a discovery in the school's basement that had been hidden deliberately. The words came in fragments. His memory faltered, but there was no mistaking the gravity of what he was saying. By midnight, the interview had gone viral. Social media flooded with messages from former students, now in their 60s and 70s, shocked and horrified. Parents who once sent their children to Roosevelt called each other, replaying the footage again and again. By morning, a swarm of reporters stood outside the school, microphones pointed toward the boarded basement doors. Detective Erin Malloy was assigned to reopen the investigation. She was 39, sharp, and unflinching, a second-generation cop who had grown up hearing whispers of the Parker girl case. Malloy's father had been a rookie on the force when Mary Ellen went missing, and his stories had shaped her sense of justice. For her, this wasn't just another cold file. It was unfinished family business. When she watched Benton's interview, she noted subtle inconsistencies. His phrasing, "by what we found and they told me not to talk," suggested more than mere guilt. He wasn't acting alone. Within 24 hours, she obtained a warrant to inspect the school property. Roosevelt Elementary had changed over the decades. The playground was new, the classrooms modernized, but the bones of the building, the foundation of 1940s brick and concrete, remained untouched. The janitor's corridor still led to the old boiler room, sealed since the renovations of 1985. The air down there was heavy, damp, and still carried that metallic tang only found beneath schools, built over decades of steam heat and dust. "What exactly am I looking for?" the young forensic technician asked as they descended. Malloy checked her flashlight, her voice steady. "The truth," she said quietly. The work began beneath the cracked concrete floor near the north wall. Benton's recorded statement mentioned a storage space under the eastern stairwell. It took the crew 5 hours to break through the sealed section, the sound of drills echoing up through the empty halls. The moment the concrete gave way, a musty odor rose, dry, earthy, unnatural. One of the technicians turned away, gagging. They all knew what it meant. The first discovery was a length of tattered fabric, a piece of denim with traces of embroidery. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then came fragments of bone, delicate as glass, preserved in the cooler air of the sealed chamber. A hair ribbon lay crumpled beside them, its color long faded. Malloy whispered the girl's name under her breath, as though saying it might somehow return her to the world that forgot her. By evening, the site was secured, cordoned off with bright yellow tape. News cameras lined the perimeter, Reporters buzzed like hornets. The school board issued a statement expressing shock and sadness, while the mayor promised full cooperation with law enforcement. But none of it mattered. To those who had lived with that silence for nearly 6 decades, the truth had begun to surface, and it was uglier than anyone imagined. When police returned to Benton's care home for further questioning, his condition had worsened. The confession had taken something out of him, like a final exhale. Malloy arrived with crime scene photos, laying them gently on the table before him, his eyes filled with tears. "I didn't hurt her," he muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't. But I didn't stop it either." Malloy leaned forward. "Who did, Harold?" "Who told you to bury it?" He swallowed, lips quivering. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said. "There was an accident and they wanted it gone. They made me keep quiet. They said the school's reputation, the district, would collapse." His pupils drifted to the ceiling, lost somewhere between guilt and dementia. "I was a coward," he whispered. "A coward who did what he was told." He refused to name anyone directly, but his records offered clues. Old payrolls from 1967 listed a temporary maintenance worker, Richard Calloway, who had been dismissed abruptly 2 weeks after the disappearance. Calloway's address led to an abandoned house on the city's east end, its plywood windows talking softly in the wind. Inside, Malloy found fragments of life frozen in disarray. A half-burned photograph of Roosevelt's staff picnic from that year, cigarette butts in a rusted ashtray, a calendar turned to April 1967. What chilled her most wasn't the clutter. It was what she found in a metal filing box under the sink, a small badge once polished, stamped with the school's emblem. It matched the ones worn by all Roosevelt employees that year, but scratched into the back were 3 letters, MEP Mary Ellen Parker. The pieces were aligning, but they refused to lock cleanly into place. Benton's confession hinted at multiple actors, all linked by one shared motive: silence. The deeper Malloy dug, the clearer it became that Mary Ellen's fate wasn't a random tragedy. It was a buried scandal, born of fear, convenience, and a community desperate to protect its own image. That night, as rain began to fall over Cincinnati, Malloy sat in her car outside the school, staring at the flickering streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. She thought of her father's old words. "Truth ain't always about justice. Sometimes it's just about finding the courage to look it in the eye." Inside the school, under years of paint and plaster, workers uncovered a small brass plaque once bolted to the main hallway wall, now tarnished and dull. It read, "In memory of Mary E. Parker, forever in our hearts." It had been covered during renovations, erased like she never existed, and in that quiet discovery, Malloy felt both fury and clarity. Harold Benton might have unlocked the door, but the real story, the one that explained why a 12-year-old vanished and how an entire system allowed it, still waited in the shadows. Cold and unfinished, the truth was coming. It just hadn't finished bleeding through yet. Detective Erin Malloy couldn't shake the unease. The old man's confession looped through her head all night, words trembling with guilt, names wrapped in fog. When dawn broke over Cincinnati, she was already back at her desk, coffee gone cold, surrounded by brittle files from 1967. Her father once said that the worst cases were the ones solved too late. He was right. Every page here felt like an apology signed in ink. The reports told a neat story. Missing child presumed abducted. But the paper trail was too tidy, signatures too uniform, timelines too short. A single note wedged between case updates caught her attention. Facility maintenance logs withheld for confidentiality. It bore the initials TS, which she traced back to Thomas Sinclair, the district superintendent at the time. Malloy called the state archives. Hours later, a weary clerk confirmed 5 school sites under Sinclair's control between 1966 and 1970. Roosevelt Elementary was his priority project. The same year Mary Ellen Parker vanished, Roosevelt received a spike in district funding for structural repairs. Malloy felt her pulse steadily climb. Government money had sealed that basement, and she wanted to know why. At the Cincinnati Records Office, an older employee fetched a thick ledger labeled Summer 67, maintenance expenses. Most entries noted paint supplies and pipe work. One line near the bottom stood out, Excavation and concrete pour R. Calloway. Heard of contractor. The date matched 2 weeks after Mary Ellen's disappearance. Calloway, the same maintenance worker Benton mentioned. Malloy stared at the faded ink, its edges smeared with decades of decay. If Calloway had sealed that basement under orders, it meant someone paid to hide more than damage. She scanned the next columns. Cost, approval signature, confirmation stamp. The signature didn't belong to Benton. It belonged to Thomas Sinclair. That evening, she returned to Benton's care home for one last conversation. He looked smaller than before, pale against white sheets, his eyes dim but clear. Malloy laid the photocopied ledger on his lap. "You didn't hire Calloway, did you?" she asked softly. Benton's throat tightened as he shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Sinclair sent him. Said there'd been an incident near the boiler. He told me to stay out of it. Said he was taking care of things." His hands trembled. "He brought men that night. They worked until morning. The next day the floor was new." Malloy waited. Silence thickened between them. "Why didn't you go to police?" she pressed. He looked away. "They told me it was an accident, that the girl had wandered into the wrong room. But when I asked where she was, they said not to ask again." His voice dropped to a rasp. "We were all scared back then. I told myself it was mercy." Benton passed away 3 days later, officially natural causes. Unofficially, his conscience had finally given out. Malloy turned to the living. Records revealed Sinclair retired in 1970 and later moved to Indianapolis. He died in 2002, leaving almost nothing behind. But archives mentioned a niece, Margaret Fulton, still living in Indiana. Malloy drove there, the highway lit by intermittent storm flashes. She arrived at a small brick house where an elderly woman opened the door, half curious, half afraid. Margaret remembered her uncle well, proud, secretive, loyal to the system that had made him. Over tea, Malloy described the reopened case. Margaret listened in silence, then retrieved a small metal box from a bedroom shelf. Inside were old letters neatly folded, the paper yellowed. One envelope bore the Cincinnati School District seal, dated July 1967. Malloy unfolded it slowly. The message inside chilled her. Repairs completed. Situation fully contained. No public disclosure necessary. Signed, Thomas Sinclair. Margaret frowned. "I never knew what that meant." He mentioned once that a child got hurt at one of the schools. He said it was handled. She paused, studying Malloy's face. "You think he was covering up a death, don't you?" Malloy didn't answer. She didn't need to. The evidence was finally forming a shape, a network of men more loyal to reputation than truth. Back in Cincinnati, press coverage exploded. Reporters replayed Benton's confession alongside archival photos of the school. Commentators debated whether the case was a single act or an institutional cover-up. Malloy avoided them all. She worked nights in silence, building a timeline too damning to ignore. The truth was becoming undeniable. In April 1967, Mary Ellen Parker likely entered the Roosevelt basement before class. Calloway, a subcontracted worker, was there. Something went wrong. Whether accident or violence, Malloy couldn't yet prove. Sinclair intervened within hours, sealing off the site and protecting the district's name. Benton stayed silent under threat. The result? A child lost to concrete and time. Forensic teams dug deeper into the reopened chamber, alongside Mary Ellen's remains. Investigators found remnants of a small metal pipe and a dented wrench, both dated to the 1960s. Forensic metallurgists suggested the wound on the girl's skull, though degraded, matched the blunt curvature of the tool. It wasn't an accident. It was a strike. Malloy sat in her car long after midnight, the river glinting under pale moonlight. She replayed Benton's guilt, Sinclair's cold wording, and Calloway's disappearance. The pieces fit, but the why still lingered like a stubborn shadow. Why risk everything to hide the death of one girl? She turned on the ignition and muttered, because protecting an image was easier than facing the truth. The next morning, Malloy wrote her interim report, each line careful, deliberate. It ended with 3 words underlined twice. Institutional concealment confirmed. She stared at them for a long time before closing the file. But there was one more thread left. Payroll records listed a second signature on the maintenance invoice, an assistant superintendent, named Robert Lunsford. That name had never appeared in the police files. When Malloy searched city directories, she learned Lunsford still lived nearby, retired in a nursing facility outside Dayton. She exhaled, the weight of history pressing down like fog. The living were fading fast, but their secrets were still breathing. Only one more person could tell her what truly happened in that basement, and whether Mary Ellen's death was covered to protect a system or to protect someone far more personal. The nursing home sat on the outskirts of Dayton, surrounded by shapeless fields fading under the October sun. Detective Erin Malloy parked beside a row of maples, shedding their last leaves, the sound of dry branches scraping against her car as the wind changed direction. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and oatmeal. It felt like time itself had slowed to a crawl here, the kind of place where memories sank deeper than sleep. Robert Lunsford was 91. When Malloy entered his room, he was awake, eyes sharp despite the wrinkles that framed them. He was thinner than his photographs from the 1960s, but his posture remained proud, the habit of a man who once held authority. A faded newspaper clipping sat on his nightstand, the one announcing that Roosevelt Elementary had overcome tragedy. He looked up when he saw her badge. "You finally came," he said, his voice gravelly but firm. Malloy didn't bother with pleasantries. "You worked for Superintendent Thomas Sinclair in 1967, she began, sitting across from him. "You authorized a payment to a maintenance worker named Richard Calloway after a girl disappeared." "I need to know why," Lunsford sighed. 58 years, he muttered. I wondered how long the silence would last. He motioned toward the window where autumn sunlight filtered through the blinds. "You think this was a crime buried by one man?" "It wasn't. It was an entire machine. Every one of us knew what the city valued: order, reputation, quiet. A child's life didn't outweigh that." Malloy leaned forward. "So you admit there was a cover-up?" Lunsford nodded slowly. "Not at first. Calloway was hired to fix the heating system in the old basement. Mary Ellen must have gone down there before class. Curious, maybe chasing her cat. Nobody meant for her to die." He swallowed hard. "But when Sinclair saw what had happened, he said we couldn't report it. The school board was already under fire for budget scandals and racial tensions. The last thing they needed was a death on school property. So he made it disappear." Malloy kept her voice steady. "Disappear how?" "He paid Calloway to seal the room, promised him double his wages and a job out of state. Banton was told it was an industrial accident involving asbestos. We filed the paperwork under safety reconstruction. I signed it. Then Sinclair handled Mary Ellen's mother personally, told her the girl had been taken, implied there was evidence of kidnapping. It gave the police an excuse to chase ghosts instead of looking under their feet." Lunsford looked at her, defeated. "That's the truth you came for. The girl died in an accident, and the rest of us let cowardice turn it into a crime far worse." Malloy sat in silence for a long moment. The hum of the oxygen machine filled the space between them. "You helped him," she said finally. He nodded once. "Yes, and I regret it every single day." There was something in his tone that caught her ear, not just guilt, but fear that stretched beyond memory. She pressed further. "You said Sinclair handled her mother. What did that mean?" Lunsford hesitated. Clara Parker wouldn't let go. Weeks passed, and she kept coming to the school begging for updates. Sinclair met with her privately one night at the board office. After that, she stopped asking questions. Just moved away. Everyone assumed grief broke her. "But," he trailed off, "but what?" "I think he did something," Lunsford whispered. He knew she was talking to reporters. 2 of them came sniffing around that summer, said they'd heard construction noise after hours. "Find out what happened to those men, Detective. You'll understand the real scope of his reach." Malloy took notes slowly, each word heavier than the last. "And Calloway." "Gone," Lunsford said. "Sinclair got him a new name, a new job. I heard rumors in the 70s that he'd moved to Pennsylvania under a different identity. I never saw him again." The clock ticked softly toward noon. For the first time, Malloy realized the investigation wasn't just about a child's disappearance. It was about how a city built its peace on silence. The name Thomas Sinclair had become synonymous with progress back then, his legacy celebrated in educational reform plaques across Cincinnati. But beneath those bronze inscriptions, Mary Ellen's body had slept for 58 years. When Lunsford's voice began to fade, she stood. "I'll find the rest," she said. "Even if everyone involved is gone, the truth won't be." As she walked toward the elevator, the old man called out behind her. "Detective," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you uncover, the city won't thank you for it." She turned, watching his figure framed by the pale afternoon light. "I'm not doing it for thanks," she replied. "I'm doing it because she deserves her name back." That night, Malloy drove back to Cincinnati. Her headlights cut through mist drifting across the highway, turning the road into a thin ribbon of uncertainty. She played the interview recording again, replaying every inflection of Lunsford's confession. The pieces were aligning now. Benton's guilt, Sinclair's manipulation, Calloway's silence, and the mother's sudden disappearance from public view. Each one connected, forming a chain that led straight to the top of Cincinnati's education system in the late 60s. But there was another voice hidden among them, the voice of a mother erased from the record. Malloy dug into archived census logs and found that Clara Parker had relocated to Cleveland in 1968, and then vanished entirely from public records by 1970. No death certificate, no forwarding address. It was as if she'd been deliberately removed. 2 days later, a small envelope arrived on Malloy's desk. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, an aerial shot of Roosevelt Elementary taken during construction in 1985. A faint rectangle on the western edge of the playground showed uneven ground where the old basement had been filled. Written on the back in faded blue ink were 3 words, "Ask about Clara." Malloy stared at the photo, the weight of decades pressing on her chest. Someone out there was still watching, still guarding what remained of the lie. The truth hadn't finished surfacing. It was just waiting for her to dig deep enough. Detective Erin Malloy could barely focus on the road. The photograph sat on the passenger seat beside her, that haunting message etched in old ink, "Ask about Clara." Whoever sent it knew what she was chasing. The question was how. The deeper she dug into the Mary Ellen case, the more it felt like the city itself was resisting her, like Cincinnati's foundations trembled each time a piece of truth came loose. At precinct headquarters, Malloy laid the photo under a magnifying glass. The 1985 construction crew's image revealed something subtle. 7 workers near the excavation trench, but blueprints listed only 6 hired for that job. The 7th man stood at a distance wearing a white hat and dark coat, out of uniform. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, nearly touching the spot that once held the basement chamber. There was no record of who he was. The handwriting on the back of the photo wasn't fresh either. Forensic analysts dated the ink to the early 90s. That meant the photo had changed hands many times before reaching her. Someone had been holding onto it, waiting for the right moment. Malloy reopened Clara Parker's file. It was slim, too slim. A mother's fight should have left more behind. Hospital records showed therapy sessions for grief management through mid-1968. Then her trail vanished. Social Security data marked her as inactive. No death notice, no relatives listed after 1970. When Malloy cross-referenced church bulletins and local directories, she found one lead, a mention of Clara volunteering briefly at a Cleveland shelter in 1969 under the name C. Parks. The detail was small, but it was enough. 2 days later, Malloy drove north through rolling grey highways. Cleveland in autumn was brittle and silent, its lake shrouded in fog that clung to the convertible tops and half-frozen piers. The shelter still stood, a converted church with stained glass patched by plywood. Inside, the manager, an older woman named Lenora, shuffled through ledgers until her finger landed on a name. Clara Parks, stayed 3 months 1969, said she was moving east. Lenora squinted. She left a box in the basement when she vanished. We kept it. Never knew what to do with it. The box was small and tin, dented at the corners, sealed with a strip of tape that had turned the color of tobacco. Malloy peeled it open carefully. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter, a child's hair ribbon, and a faded photograph of a man she didn't recognize. The letter was addressed to Mr. Sinclair but unsigned. Clara had written it by hand, the ink uneven and desperate. You told me this was an accident. You promised the truth would be made right, but she visits me in dreams, crying from behind walls. I've seen where you built over her. I can't live with this silence. If I speak, you'll lose everything. If I don't, I'll lose my soul." Malloy's chest tightened as she read it again. Clara had known, not just suspected. She'd found out that the school had been rebuilt over her daughter, and Sinclair had found a way to stop her. When Malloy returned to her car, she sat staring at the skyline until dusk. The city lights blinked faintly through fog, like distant stars fading behind clouds. Clara Parker had vanished shortly after writing that letter. Sinclair's influence stretched far enough to bury both mother and child in different ways. But who sent the new message? Who wanted Malloy to ask about Clara now? Back at headquarters, she shared her findings with Captain Ruiz, who had reluctantly approved the reopened investigation. He frowned, rubbing his temples as she laid the evidence across his desk. "You're chasing ghosts, Malloy. Everyone involved is dead. There's no one left to prosecute." "I'm not looking for prosecution," she said. "I'm looking for accountability." "Someone knew. Someone still does," he exhaled heavily. "You're stirring up a city that's been trying to forget this for half a century." She paused before answering. "Maybe that's the problem. It never forgot. It just covered the memory with concrete." Ruiz looked away. "Do what you have to, but keep it clean and stay off camera. The city council's already nervous." Malloy didn't tell him about the second envelope that had arrived that morning, smaller, older. Inside was a single typewritten note. She never left Cleveland. Look for the river. No signature, no hint of origin. The next evening she followed that clue. The Cuyahoga River wound like a black vein through Cleveland's industrial heart, nearly silent, under the weight of warehouses and bridges. Near an abandoned textile mill, her flashlight caught a metal plate bolted to a retaining wall. The letters CP were faintly etched into it. Curious, she called in ground-penetrating radar from the local coroner's office. Beneath the soil were traces of bone fragments. Female, adult, approximately late 30s. It took 3 weeks for lab confirmation. DNA testing matched the remains to Mary Ellen Parker's mother. The report hit Malloy harder than she expected. Clara hadn't simply disappeared, she'd been silenced. It was unmistakable now. After threatening to expose the district's corruption, she'd been killed and buried miles from where her daughter lay. And while Sinclair's fingerprints had long vanished from files and newspapers, his shadow remained everywhere. In the sealed budgets, the sudden resignations, the renaming of Roosevelt Elementary after his retirement. The final piece fell together when Malloy tracked down property records for the textile mill. The building had been sold in 1970 to a development company under the name Midwest Educational Trust. The founder, Thomas Sinclair. That night, Malloy stood outside the ruins of Roosevelt Elementary. The old building was silent, the windows boarded but glowing faintly from streetlight glare. For a moment she imagined she could hear faint echoes of playground laughter, the life that was stolen, the guilt that festered in its place. 58 years of silence had ended, not with a verdict, but with 2 graves finally connected. She turned off her recorder, pocketed the final photograph, and whispered to the dark, "They can't hide you anymore." Her breath fogged in the air before fading. Wind rustled through the empty lot. The city slept beyond the hill, unaware of the reckoning quietly unfolding in its name. The next morning, headlines across Ohio would read, "Cold case breakthrough, detective connects 2 generations of silence." But Malloy knew this wasn't closure. It was exposure. Cincinnati didn't need peace. It needed truth. And for the first time since 1967, Mary Ellen Parker had it. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of sky that pressed down on the city like a secret refusing to stay buried. The Parker case had exploded beyond control. Reporters camped outside the station. Newspapers ran retrospectives about 1967. And across Cincinnati, people argued in grocery stores and diners. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a memory. For Detective Erin Malloy, though, the noise didn't matter. She'd found 2 graves, yes, but one question still gnawed at her. Who had sent those envelopes? She was sure now that someone alive was feeding her those clues. Someone who'd been keeping this story alive for decades. Maybe a witness, maybe an accomplice looking for absolution. Either way, they weren't finished talking. On her desk that morning lay yet another envelope, smaller than the last. Same thin paper, no fingerprints. Inside, only a photograph torn from a yearbook. It showed a group of students from Roosevelt's 1967 class. In the second row, between two boys, sat Mary Ellen Parker. Behind her, a tall man in a teacher's suit, his face sharp, unreadable. On the back were 4 typed words. He was there too. Malloy enlarged the image until the grain blurred into static. She recognized the man from old faculty records, Mr. Leonard Fisk, a 5th-grade teacher who resigned mid-semester in 1968. There had been no mention of him in any police file, no interview, no address. Like so many others, he'd simply slipped out of history once the scandal began. She found an address in a public education archive, retired, residing in Covington, Kentucky, 50 minutes south. No phone record, no relatives listed. Malloy drove out that afternoon, the Ohio River glinting in the distance, bridges rising like relics under washed-out clouds. Fisk's house sat on a quiet street near a row of decaying storefronts. Paint peeled from the window frames. An empty birdcage hung by the door. Malloy knocked twice before a voice muttered from inside, "Go away." "Mr. Fisk," she said, holding up her badge. "Detective Malloy, Cincinnati PD. I'm here about Mary Ellen Parker." A pause followed, long enough for her to think he'd refuse. Then the door creaked open. The man before her was thin and stooped, eyes sunken but alert. "I wondered when you'd come," he muttered. Inside, photographs of children decorated the walls. Classes from decades past, faces frozen behind glass. Malloy took a seat across from him in a cluttered living room. "You taught at Roosevelt Elementary in 1967, she said. "You were there when Mary Ellen disappeared." He rubbed his temples. "I told them what I saw," he said. "Nobody wanted to hear it, so tell me now." He hesitated, then leaned forward. "That morning I came early to prepare lesson plans. I saw Mary Ellen walking by the maintenance door. Sinclair was already on site. He wasn't supposed to be there that day. He had Calloway with him. The girl stopped to talk to them. I thought nothing of it until I heard a scream." He paused, voice trembling. "When I went down there, she was gone. Sinclair told me to leave the area immediately. Said there'd been an electrical hazard. Hours later, the janitor told me the floor was sealed off." Malloy's pulse quickened. "Did you report it?" "I tried. Benton shut me down. He said Sinclair handled it, that the authorities were satisfied. When I insisted, my contract wasn't renewed. After that, my phone went silent. Neighbors said strange men were asking questions about me. I moved across the river to start over. Why stay silent?" He sighed. "Because everyone who spoke disappeared. I had a wife, a son. Fear keeps you quiet longer than guilt." Malloy studied him. "You've kept that fear for nearly 60 years. He nodded. "Until I saw the news." Benton's confession. "I realized the truth finally had a voice louder than mine." He met her gaze, tired but resolute. "You're close, Detective." But Sinclair didn't act alone. There were more, people above him. Sponsors who protected their image through influence. Industrial donors who funded the school board and didn't want exposure. Her mind reeled. "You're saying this went beyond the district?" "I'm saying," he whispered, "the city itself was built on silence. Follow the money behind Sinclair's projects. You'll find names that still run this city today." He handed her a worn folder from a drawer. Inside were old newsletters from 1967, highlighting education reform initiatives sponsored by a private foundation called the Mid-Ohio Civic Trust. Beside its name were 3 board members, one of whom, Charles Whitmer, was now the sitting state senator for Ohio. Malloy felt the ground shift beneath her reasoning. What began as a child's disappearance had grown into something systemic. Decades of influence, buried scandals, and power traded for silence. It wasn't just history. It was continuity. "Why keep these?" she asked. Fisk managed a faint smile. "Because one day, someone like you would come knocking." That night back in Cincinnati, Malloy photocopied every document and filed them under a new heading, The Parker Investigation, Phase 2. The deeper she went, the clearer the truth became. The case was no longer just about Mary Ellen and her mother. It was about how an entire generation chose convenience over conscience. Her apartment felt colder than usual. She sat by the window, smoke from the city's chimneys rising against the clouds. On the glass, she taped one photo. Mary Ellen smiling faintly in that old class picture. "You're not forgotten," she whispered. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number read simply, "Stop digging, detective. You found what you needed. Leave the rest buried." Attached was a new image, the same Roosevelt playground taken at night. A shadowed figure stood near the fence, watching. Malloy's grip tightened around the phone. She knew then that the fight wasn't over. The people who had buried the truth once were still out there, their reach as wide as their fear. But unlike those before her, she wasn't going to be silenced. In the reflection of the window, her eyes caught the faint glint of the photo's edge. Mary Ellen's small smile frozen forever, innocent and undefeated. It was the only reminder she needed, because truth had already begun to cost her, and she intended to pay every cent of it. The station was quieter than usual that morning, though every phone seemed to ring with half-whispered questions. The Parker investigation had spread like wildfire through official channels. Someone at City Hall wanted the case closed fast. Erin Malloy could feel it, the kind of political heat that made truth melt before it hardened. She stood by the coffee machine, staring at the headlines rolling across the morning news feed. Detective links school cover-up to historic education scandal. The reporters had caught wind of the Mid-Ohio Civic Trust connection, which meant confidentiality was over. Her captain's office door was shut tight. When it opened, Ruiz called her in without looking up from his desk. "You're making powerful people nervous," he said flatly. "They've already called the mayor, the attorney general. Even the governor's office is asking questions. Off the record, they want you reassigned." Malloy folded her arms. "And what do you want?" He looked up then, weary but honest. "I want you to keep breathing, Erin. You have a career ahead of you, and this thing you're chasing, it's bigger than justice. It's poison. Walk away." But Malloy had seen too much. "If I quit now, that girl's story dies again," she said quietly. "And so does her mother's." She turned toward the door. "I'm not walking away." Ruiz didn't stop her, but his parting words lingered. "Then watch your back, kid." By afternoon, Malloy sat inside a dim records room in City Hall, where archives hissed beneath flickering fluorescent lights. She wore gloves as she flipped through yellow donation ledgers from the 1960s. The more she read, the more Sinclair's network came into focus. The Mid-Ohio Civic Trust had laundered public funds into school improvement grants, but the receipts told a different story. Hotel expenses, private flights, hush payments disguised as consultancy fees. Her finger stopped on a typed entry. "Special transfer, June 67. Roosevelt Elementary allocation, adjusted per superintendent's discretion." Next to it, Sinclair's initials. But below that appeared another approval signature that chilled her. Charles Whitmer. The same man Fisk had warned about. Now a senator still active in Ohio politics. Malloy took out her phone and snapped photos of every ledger page before security walked by. She'd learned to move quietly. The wrong discovery in the right room could make evidence vanish overnight. Leaving City Hall, she spotted a familiar car parked across the street. Dark sedan, tinted windows, engine idling. It was the third time that week she'd seen it. She pretended not to notice, but the chill crept underneath her coat. At home that night, her phone buzzed again. No name, no number. The message read, "You still don't see the whole picture." Attached was a 10-second video clip showing footage from 1967, grainy, black and white, likely from a school camera. The image shook, but clearly showed the Roosevelt courtyard. Two men carried what looked like a large sack toward the maintenance door. One of them was unmistakably Sinclair. The other, though older footage obscured his face, matched Whitmer's height and build. Her stomach turned. That tape shouldn't exist. Any surveillance from that era should have been erased long ago. Whoever sent her the clip had access to classified archives, maybe even someone inside the system. Fisk had mentioned that Sinclair's influence extended beyond schools. What if Whitmer had inherited not just his power, but his secrets? She replayed the clip again and again until the frame froze on the shadowed face of the second man. It wasn't entirely clear, but she knew it was him. Whitmer. He'd been there. By morning, Whitmer's name was trending on social media. An anonymous whistleblower had leaked portions of the film online. The reaction was instant: disbelief, outrage, then silence from every official channel. Within hours, His office released a statement denying any involvement in the 1967 incident, calling it a tragic case exploited for political theater. But the damage had been done. For the first time, Cincinnati felt the old walls begin to crack. Malloy drove to her father's grave that evening, a small plot overlooking the river. The sunset reflected off the water, burning gold before fading to blue. Her father had chased this same case when he was a rookie. He'd told her once that truth had a cost, not in lives, but in loneliness. She finally understood what he meant. "I'm close, Dad," she whispered, "closer than anyone's ever been." The wind picked up, rustling dead leaves across the path. Somewhere downtown, police radios chattered with escalating noise. Reporters clustered outside Whitmer's offices, demanding answers. But beneath all the chaos, she sensed the danger sharpening. Whitmer still had friends in power, and if Sinclair's old network still existed, they wouldn't let this end quietly. She drove back toward the city as night fell, headlights carving through drizzle. When she reached her apartment, the door was ajar. Malloy froze. One hand went to her holster as she stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes, stale, foreign. Her files were gone. The copies of ledgers, Fisk's photo, Clara's letter, all missing. Only one thing had been left behind, taped to the fridge, a single Polaroid. It showed her standing beside her car outside City Hall earlier that day. Scrawled across the bottom in black marker was a message: "Stop digging or join them." For the first time in months, fear tightened her throat. But beneath it burned something stronger: fury. They could steal her files, threaten her, even erase her name if they wanted. But they couldn't bury the truth anymore. Not after everything. Malloy called the precinct, voice steady. "Captain Ruiz," she said, "schedule a press conference for tomorrow. I'm releasing everything." Silence followed, then Ruiz's quiet sigh. "Once you do this, there's no turning back." "There never was," she said. That night, she barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces. Mary Ellen, Clara, Benton, even Sinclair, all folded into the same legacy of silence. This wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about forcing a city to finally look at itself. When dawn came, pale and colorless, she walked to the mirror, straightened her jacket, and whispered the same words her father once told her: "If you can't be safe, at least be truthful." Cincinnati was about to hear everything, and for those who had built their power on the bones of a child, the reckoning was finally at their door. The rain had stopped by morning, but the clouds hung low over Cincinnati like a premonition. Detective Erin Malloy stood outside the precinct, holding a folder pressed tightly under her arm. Inside it were digital copies of every surviving document, donation ledgers, correspondence between Sinclair and Whitmer, Clara Parker's letters, transcripts from Benton and Lunsford. It was all there. The skeleton of a story the city had avoided telling for nearly 6 decades. She had made her choice. At 11 sharp, she would go public. The press conference had been hastily arranged in the precinct lobby. Reporters filled every free inch of space, their cameras humming with anticipation. The hum of whispers ran through the air like static. The scandal had already reached a fever pitch. Now everyone was waiting for someone to say what the city refused to admit aloud. Ruiz caught her eye from across the room. His expression held a mixture of pride and dread. He leaned close as she walked up to the podium. "Once you say this," he murmured, "they won't forgive you." She gave a faint, tired smile. "I'm not asking them to." When she took the microphone, the flashes blinded her for a moment. She steadied herself, then began. 58 years ago, 12-year-old Mary Ellen Parker disappeared from Roosevelt Elementary School. For decades, her case was labeled unsolved. But it was never unsolved, it was buried. Today, I am releasing evidence that shows her death was not only known to officials in 1967, but deliberately concealed by members of the Cincinnati School District and the Mid-Ohio Civic Trust. The room buzzed with gasps and shouting. Cameras clicked endlessly. But Malloy kept her tone calm, almost clinical. "I hold documents signed by Thomas Sinclair, the former superintendent, ordering structural sealing of the Roosevelt basement within days of the disappearance. I have confirmed testimonies linking his associates, including now Senator Charles Whitmer, to the concealment effort. These records confirm government funds were used to hide the remains of a child beneath public property, an act that extended to silencing her mother, Clara Parker, who was later found murdered and buried in Cleveland. This was not coincidence. It was a system protecting itself. Her final line hit like a hammer. "The truth belongs to Mary Ellen Parker, and we took 60 years too long to give it back." Questions erupted from every direction, names shouted, accusations fired, but she left the podium wordlessly. Ruiz stepped in, waving for calm. She kept walking until she was outside, breathing in the cold air like it might steady her heart. That afternoon, chaos swept through the city. The story dominated every local broadcast. Washington outlets picked it up by evening. The senator's office issued a blanket denial, claiming tampering and political sabotage. A state judge ordered the immediate preservation of all files related to the case. The governor announced a formal inquiry. Cincinnati was no longer silent. But with attention came danger. By the third day, Malloy noticed the same sedan following her again, sometimes parked outside her building, other times stationing near the precinct. She'd filed reports, but nothing came of them. Late one night, as she reviewed documents at her desk, a call came from an unknown number. A man's voice, low and calm. "You did what you had to do," he said. "Now let it rest." "Who is this?" she snapped. Silence. Then, "You've already brought it into the light. Don't make the mistake of thinking light kills shadows." The line went dead. Malloy sat there in the dark for a long time. She wasn't scared anymore, she was resolute. Fear had built this silence, but truth was beginning to fracture it. For the first time in 58 years, Cincinnati was forced to look in the mirror. 2 weeks later, the results of the state investigation hit. The findings confirmed everything: embezzlement, fraudulent contracts, falsified maintenance records, and criminal negligence stretching over multiple administrations. Whitmer's name appeared more than once, tied to the first corporate fund that masked Roosevelt's renovation project. After days of public outcry, he announced a temporary suspension of duties. But the people didn't want suspension. They wanted justice. At Roosevelt Elementary, crews gathered to dismantle the boarded-off section of the yard for good. A memorial marker was set in place, simple in its words: "In memory of Mary Ellen Parker, 1955-1967, and her mother, Clara." Truth endures where silence once stood. Hundreds came, some elderly now, former students who remembered that hollow day in '67. Malloy stood among them, anonymous in the crowd, hands tucked into her coat pockets, as prayers drifted through the crisp November air. A little girl standing beside her, holding her mother's hand, looked up and asked, "Mommy, why are they sad?" The mother answered softly, "Because someone finally told the truth." Malloy felt her throat close. She turned away as the crowd began to sing, the sound trembling like the city itself waking from a long sleep. That evening, Ruiz met her in his office, now cluttered with papers from the case. "The Attorney General's office called," he said. "They're opening a special inquiry on the legislative side. Whitmer's associates are lawyering up, and the Civic Trust's assets are frozen." "You did it, Erin." She shook her head. "We just started what should have happened decades ago." He studied her. "You're not staying, are you?" "No," she said quietly. "There's another unit in Columbus that handles historical crime reconstruction. They asked me to join. It feels right." Ruiz nodded, understanding. "You'll do fine there. Just don't forget to breathe once in a while." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I will." That night, her last in Cincinnati, she drove past Roosevelt Elementary one final time. The construction lights glowed against the dark, workers clearing the last remnants of old concrete. Somewhere beneath that earth, generations of lies had been stripped away. She parked across the street, engine running softly, rain misting the windshield. Through the haze, she thought she saw a shape, a small figure by the fence, standing still as a shadow. A girl, maybe 12, wearing a dress that caught the faint orange glow of the streetlights. Malloy blinked. The image dissolved as headlights passed, leaving only the empty yard. She stayed there for a moment longer, staring through the silence. Then she whispered the only thing left to say. Rest now. The rain grew steadier, rippling across the glass like old tears finally released. As she pulled away, the city lights shimmered behind her, refracted in puddles that mirrored everything. The past, the present, and a truth too long ignored. Cincinnati exhaled. The silence was over. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.